One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Neil Armstrong was easily one of the biggest poster boys of the U.S.'s space triumph after famously becoming the first man to walk the moon.
Being number one on the moon was going to be a really, really big deal.
However, this superstar left a cryptic message before his death, which real meaning hides the terrifying secret about the whole moon landing. Joe Rogan dissected this shocking secret in one of his podcast episodes, and we invite you to follow as we analyze this terrifying secret revealed by Neil Armstrong.
Well, it seemed if you were a conspiracy theory, this would give you a rock-hard boner. Because listen to this.
Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance. Next generation of taxpayers.
We have no. Just play the whole thing so you don't confuse everybody.
In 1994, Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance and held back tears as he spoke these brief cryptic remarks before the next generation of taxpayers as they toured the White House.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you, we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
What does that mean?
Neil Armstrong needs no introduction as a remarkable person who made history by becoming the first human to walk on the moon. He had always wanted to fly. He was born on August 5th, 1930, near less than 60 miles from the Wright brothers' workshop in Dayton. When he was 6 years old, young Neil rode in his first airplane, a Tin Goose Ford tri-motor passenger plane. He was hooked. At 16, Armstrong earned his student pilot's license even before he had a driver's license. In 1947, Armstrong attended Purdue University on a naval scholarship, studying aeronautical engineering. As part of his scholarship, the Navy trained Armstrong as a fighter pilot in Florida. His college studies were interrupted by the outbreak of the Korean War, where Armstrong flew 78 combat missions. His aircraft, the F-9F Panther jet, was one of the first jet fighters to launch from a carrier. After finishing college, Armstrong went to work for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, which became the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958. This mild-mannered kid from Ohio made his name as one of the most daring and skilled test pilots at NASA's Flight Research Center, now renamed after him at Edwards Air Force Base in California. During his 7 years as a test pilot, Armstrong flew 200 different aircraft that pushed the limits of speed and altitude, including the legendary X-15. High over the California desert, Armstrong reached speeds of more than 4,000 miles per hour and took the needle-nosed X-15 to the edge of space. Armstrong's steady hand as a test pilot was instrumental to the success of NASA's first Mercury astronauts. Soon, he'd become one of them. In 1962, Armstrong was chosen for NASA's astronaut training program in Houston, but he and his wife Janet also lost their second child, a 2-year-old daughter named Karen, to an inoperable brain tumor. Armstrong buried himself in his work preparing for the Gemini program, NASA's next step toward reaching the moon. In 1966, Armstrong was chosen as command pilot for the Gemini 8 mission, the first time that NASA astronauts would attempt to connect two spacecraft in orbit, a difficult and dangerous maneuver known as rendezvous and docking. Armstrong and his co-pilot David Scott successfully docked with an unmanned Agena target vehicle, but soon after their spacecraft began to spin uncontrollably due to a malfunctioning thruster. Armstrong managed to stabilize the Gemini 8 by using the re-entry control system, but had to abort the mission and make an emergency landing in the Pacific Ocean. It was a close call, but Armstrong's calmness and quick thinking saved the day. Armstrong's next and final mission was the one that would make him immortal. In 1969, he was selected as the commander of Apollo 11, the first manned mission to land on the moon. He was joined by Lunar Module pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin and Command Module pilot Michael Collins. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V rocket carrying Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Kennedy, Florida, watched by millions of people on television. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin separated from Collins in the Command Module and descended in the Lunar Module Eagle toward the moon's surface. As they approached their landing site, they realized that it was full of boulders and craters and had to find a safer spot. Armstrong took manual control of the Eagle and flew it over the hazardous terrain, while Aldrin called out the altitude and fuel levels. With only seconds of fuel left, Armstrong found a clear area and gently touched down. He reported to Mission Control, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." After checking the systems and preparing the equipment, Armstrong and Aldrin opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder of the Eagle. On July 20th, 1969, at 10:56 p.m., Armstrong earned the prestige of being the first person to step on the moon. As he took his first step, Armstrong famously said, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." He was followed by Aldrin, who described the moon as magnificent desolation. Together, they spent about 2.5 hours on the lunar surface, collecting rocks and planting a U.S. flag that was important, and talking to President Richard Nixon via a telephone link. They also deployed scientific instruments, including a laser reflector and a seismometer. They left behind a plaque that read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." After rejoining Collins in the Command Module, the Apollo 11 crew returned to Earth and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969. They were greeted by cheering crowds and a ticker tape parade in New York City. They also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Nixon and the Congressional Space Medal of Honor from President Jimmy Carter. They became global celebrities and heroes, but none more so than Armstrong, who was hailed as the first man on the moon. Many, however, insist Armstrong's landing was faked. This included Joe Rogan.
And I've looked at a lot of very compelling documentaries that explain why they think it was hoaxed. And they'll show you some footage, and you can look at some of the footage, and it looks fake. There's some footage that, to me, looks really doctored.
Why do people doubt the moon landing? One of the most popular and persistent theories that the moon landing was faked is based on the observation that the American flag planted by the astronauts looks like it is flapping in the wind, which is impossible on the moon where there is no atmosphere. This theory claims that the flag was actually a prop attached to a wire or a fan, and that the whole scene was filmed in a studio on Earth. The proponents of this theory argue that the flag's movement proves that the moon landing was a hoax orchestrated by NASA and the U.S. government to deceive the public and to win the space race with the Soviet Union. The flag conspiracy theory has been widely circulated and popularized by various books, documentaries, websites, and social media platforms. Some of the most influential sources of this theory are the 1974 book, We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle by Bill Kaysing, a former employee of Rocketdyne, the company that built the Saturn V rocket engines. Kaysing claimed that he had insider information that the moon landing was faked and that the flag was one of the many clues that exposed the fraud. The 1976 book, NASA Mooned America, by Ralph Rene, a self-taught engineer and inventor. Rene claimed that he had conducted extensive research and experiments that proved that the moon landing was impossible and that the flag was a clear sign of a hoax. He also accused NASA of murdering several astronauts and whistleblowers who tried to reveal the truth. The 2001 Fox TV documentary Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? Hosted by Mitch Pileggi, best known for his role as Walter Skinner in The X-Files. The documentary featured interviews with several moon landing skeptics, including Kaysing and Rene, who pointed out the flag and other alleged anomalies in the Apollo footage. The documentary was watched by 15 million viewers and sparked a renewed interest in the moon landing conspiracy theories. The 2016 YouTube video, The Moon Landing Hoax, explained in detail by ODD. Reality, a popular channel that promotes various conspiracy theories and alternative views. The video has over 4 million views and presents the flag and other evidence that the moon landing was staged. The video also claims that the moon landing was part of a larger agenda to hide the true shape and nature of the Earth, which the channel believes is flat. The flag conspiracy theory is appealing to many people who distrust the official version of history and science, and who seek alternative explanations for the world's events. However, for more context, the theory also taps into the cultural and political tensions of the Cold War era, when the US and the Soviet Union were competing for global dominance and influence. Another point raised by these theorists is the conspicuous absence of stars in the background of the images and videos captured on the moon's surface. This particular aspect has fueled speculation and debate, suggesting that these visual records were not taken on the lunar surface, but rather in a studio designed to simulate the moon's environment. The theory posits that if the lunar landings were genuine, the cameras used during the missions should have captured the stars in the vast black sky. The moon, having no atmosphere, would not scatter sunlight in the way Earth does, which should make stars appear even brighter against the pitch-black backdrop of space. This absence of stars is seen by proponents of the theory as a glaring inconsistency, one that suggests lighting conditions typical of a controlled studio setting rather than the natural lighting conditions one would expect in space. Proponents argue that the technology and expertise available at the time would have allowed for the creation of sophisticated sets capable of mimicking the lunar surface. They suggest that the terrain, the lighting, and even the behavior of dust particles could have been carefully choreographed to simulate a low-gravity environment. This would include managing the lighting in such a way as to prevent stars from appearing in the background, possibly due to concerns that their positions or brightness might not accurately reflect what would be seen from the moon, thereby risking exposure of the fabrication. Another point raised by skeptics revolves around the quality and characteristics of the photographic and filming equipment allegedly used on the moon. It is suggested that the limitations of this equipment in the context of the lunar environment were not sufficiently accounted for in the official narrative. Cameras were supposedly calibrated for the stark lunar daylight, which would make capturing the relatively faint light of distant stars challenging. However, conspiracy theorists argue that this explanation is too convenient and does not adequately address why not even the brightest stars managed to make an appearance in any of the visual records. The theory further delves into the specifics of how a studio setup would have allowed for greater control over the depiction of the lunar surface, including the angles and shadows cast by the sun. Critics of the moon landing argue that the lighting seen in the photos and videos exhibits characteristics of artificial lighting, such as uniformity and directionality inconsistent with sunlight in space. This controlled environment would also conveniently account for the absence of stars, as including them would have required precise astronomical knowledge and the ability to replicate the exact appearance of the celestial sphere as viewed from the moon. Another one of the core arguments fueled by those who believe the moon landing was staged centers on the observation that the lunar module did not leave any blast crater or dust trail when it landed or took off from the moon's surface. This particular point of contention suggests that rather than the lunar module executing a controlled descent and ascent powered by its own propulsion systems, it was instead lowered onto the moon's surface and subsequently lifted away by wires or a crane, a method that would be more consistent with cinematic special effects than with actual space exploration. The lack of visible disturbance beneath the lunar module is often cited as evidence against the authenticity of the moon landing. Proponents of this theory argue that the powerful engines required for the descent and takeoff of the lunar module should have displaced a significant amount of lunar dust and debris, creating a noticeable blast crater beneath the module. The absence of such a crater is seen as inconsistent with the expected outcomes of a spacecraft landing on and taking off from a celestial body covered in fine lunar regolith. This discrepancy leads to speculation that the lunar module was never subjected to the forces and conditions of a genuine lunar landing, but was instead carefully positioned and manipulated using earthly methods designed to simulate the appearance of a moon landing. Furthering this argument, observers note the pristine condition of the lunar surface in photographs and footage of the module's landing site. If the lunar module had descended with the force and thrust necessary to counteract the moon's gravitational pull, it stands to reason that a considerable disturbance in the lunar dust and regolith would be visible. The expectation would be a cloud of dust kicked up by the descent engine's exhaust, settling around and potentially on the module itself. However, the images and videos shared with the public show a clean landing site, with undisturbed dust and no evidence of the displacement that would ostensibly accompany such a landing. This observation feeds into the belief that the scene was staged, with the module's placement on the moon's surface achieved through mechanical means that would not disturb the ground, such as lowering by wires. Moreover, the theory posits that if the lunar landing had been authentic, the takeoff of the lunar module back to lunar orbit would also have resulted in visible signs of disturbance on the moon's surface, such as a dust trail or debris scattered by the force of the takeoff. The absence of such evidence in the aftermath of the module's ascent is seen as further proof that the event was orchestrated on Earth, in a controlled environment where the effects of lunar dust and debris could be meticulously managed or entirely omitted to suit the narrative of a successful moon landing. This line of reasoning is bolstered by comparisons to how other spacecraft landings and takeoffs produce visible effects on their landing sites, whether on Earth or other celestial bodies explored by robots and landers. The contrast between these known outcomes and the pristine condition of the lunar module's landing and takeoff sites serves as a foundation for the argument that the moon landing was not a genuine extraterrestrial endeavor, but a carefully crafted illusion designed to captivate and deceive the public. Another of the enduring points of contention that fuels the theory that the moon landing was faked centers around the astronauts' footprints on the lunar surface. Skeptics argue that the clarity and preservation of these footprints are suspicious, given the moon's lack of moisture and erosive processes. The moon, unlike Earth, has no atmosphere to speak of, which means it lacks the conditions necessary for weathering and erosion as we understand them on our planet. There is no wind, rain, or the biological activity that contributes to the gradual degradation of imprints on terrestrial soil. Therefore, on the surface, it might seem plausible that footprints, once made, would remain undisturbed on the moon. However, theorists point out that this very lack of atmospheric interference should, paradoxically, make it impossible for the footprints to have formed with such a definition in the first place. The argument hinges on the nature of lunar regolith, the fine dust and rocky debris that covers the moon's surface. Without moisture to bind this material together, skeptics question how the astronauts' footprints could appear so detailed and well-preserved. On Earth, moisture plays a crucial role in the formation of clear imprints in sand, mud, or soil. It acts as a binding agent, allowing particles to adhere and retain the shape of whatever disturbs them. Without this moisture on the moon, these theorists argue that the astronauts' footprints should have been more akin to indistinct, shallow marks rather than the sharp, detailed impressions that were photographed and broadcast to the world. Furthermore, the theory posits that the footprints' preservation and definition point to the involvement of external factors, such as the manipulation of the lunar surface or the use of artificial materials to simulate the moon's environment. These theorists often suggest that the footprints were too perfect, too similar to what one would expect in wet sand on Earth. This similarity fuels speculation that the footprints were staged as part of a grandiose hoax, crafted within a controlled environment where variables could be manipulated to achieve the desired effect. Proponents of the theory also question the mechanics of walking on the moon, as depicted in the Apollo footage. The astronauts were shown bounding across the lunar surface with a buoyancy attributed to the moon's lower gravity. However, skeptics argue that the force exerted on the lunar regolith should not have been sufficient to create such deep, distinct footprints, given the astronauts' reduced weight. They suggest that if the moon landing had indeed taken place, the astronauts' steps would have left only faint traces, if any at all, on the moon's surface. Let's return to another reason Joe Rogan believed the moon landing was a hoax.
The press conference from 1969 when they returned from the moon is one of the most cryptic, weird things you'll ever see. These guys look like they just stole something and they're being questioned. I've never seen a video where people look like they're more full of shit than that video of the press conference from 1969. It's weird, man. It's weird. They're like fidgety and looking nervous, like they're getting away
So
with
they
something.
didn't do it then.
They might have done it.
Critics and skeptics, including notable figures like Rogan, have pointed to the astronauts' body language and demeanor during this interview as evidence supporting the theory that they were not truthful about their historic journey. Here is how the criticism breaks down. The astronauts' body language. The astronauts' body language during the post-moon landing press conference has been dissected and analyzed by skeptics to argue that their behavior was not consistent with that of individuals who had just achieved one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. Observers have pointed out that the crew members appeared unusually reserved, nervous, and at times evasive, which contrasted starkly with the expected demeanor of triumphant explorers returning from an unprecedented mission. Lack of eye contact. It has been noted that the astronauts often avoided making direct eye contact with the journalists and attendees. In the realm of body language analysis, such avoidance can be interpreted as a sign of discomfort, dishonesty, or the desire to hide something. The expectation might have been for a more direct, confident engagement, reflective of the monumental achievement they were there to discuss. Fidgeting and discomfort. The crew's physical behavior also seemed to tell a story of its own. There were moments when they appeared to fidget, an action often associated with nervousness or stress. This physical unease could be construed as evidence of internal conflict or guilt about participating in a supposed fabrication of the moon landing. Minimal gesturing. The astronauts' gestures were notably subdued throughout the interview. Typically, expressive gestures accompany vivid recounting of experiences, especially ones as significant as landing on the moon. The lack of such gesturing could be interpreted as a lack of engagement with the narrative they were presenting, possibly suggesting that the story they were telling was not their own. Contrived emotions. Skeptics have also pointed out moments where the astronauts' emotional expression seemed contrived or suppressed. The joy and excitement that would naturally stem from such a historic achievement were notably muted, replaced instead by what appeared to be rehearsed responses. This discrepancy between expected and observed emotional responses adds another layer of suspicion to their account. The analysis of the astronauts' body language cannot be complete without considering the psychological aspects that might influence such behaviors. Stress, anxiety, and the pressure of being under intense public scrutiny could naturally lead to the behaviors observed, regardless of the veracity of their mission. However, from the perspective of those endorsing the conspiracy theory, these psychological responses are seen not just as symptoms of stress, but as indications of the immense burden of carrying a fabricated story. Cognitive dissonance. If the astronauts were indeed participants in a hoax, they would be experiencing cognitive dissonance, that is, holding two conflicting beliefs simultaneously, the truth of their experience versus the public narrative. This internal conflict could manifest through the nervous behaviors observed during the interview. Stress under scrutiny. The astronauts knew they were the focus of global attention, and the pressure to maintain a specific narrative could have contributed to their apparent discomfort. This scrutiny, especially if they were hiding a monumental secret, would exacerbate stress responses, making it difficult to appear natural and at ease. Fear of slip-ups. The fear of accidentally revealing the truth or contradicting the official narrative could lead to cautious, measured responses, which might explain the lack of spontaneity and enthusiasm in their recounting of the moon landing. The interpretation of the astronauts' body language and behavior plays a crucial role in the moon landing conspiracy theory. These nonverbal cues are seen as pieces of a larger puzzle, suggesting that the landing was a highly sophisticated hoax. The theory posits that the astronauts, being honorable men, were placed in an impossible situation, forced to perpetuate a narrative for reasons of national pride or technological posturing during the Cold War era.